What would you do if a terrified stranger slipped you a note begging for help? Shaquille O'Neal just wanted a late-night snack, a simple stop at a gas station, nothing unusual. But then he saw the cashier, a teenage boy, pale and shaking. The kid barely looked up as he rang up Shaq's order. And then, it happened. The teen slid a crumpled note across the counter. Shaq's fingers closed around it. His eyes scanned the hurried, desperate handwriting. "Help me! He won't let me leave!" Shaq's stomach dropped. A tall, dangerous-looking man stood near the door watching, waiting. The air grew thick with tension. Shaq knew one thing for sure. He wasn't leaving without that kid. Shaquille O'Neal pulled into the dimly lit gas station, rolling his shoulders as he yawned. It had been a long night. Another charity event, another round of handshakes, and another reminder of how much work there was still to do. His SUV hummed quietly as he turned off the engine, stretching his massive frame before stepping out. The neon glow of the convenience store flickered slightly, casting a bluish hue on the near-empty parking lot. He wasn't in the mood for attention tonight. No autographs, no selfies, just a quick snack and maybe an energy drink to keep him awake for the rest of the drive home. As he walked inside, the automatic doors whooshed open, letting in a blast of cold air. The store was quiet, too quiet. Shaq immediately noticed the cashier, a scrawny teenage boy who looked no older than 16, maybe 17. His uniform vest was slightly oversized, and he stood stiffly behind the counter, his hands fidgeting near the register. But what really caught Shaq's attention was the way the boy kept glancing outside, toward a black van parked near the gas pumps. Shaq followed his gaze. The van's engine was off, but the driver was still inside, barely visible behind the dark-tinted windows. The sight sent a prickling sensation up Shaq's spine. Something was off. Grabbing a bottle of water and a protein bar, Shaq made his way to the front, moving slower now, his instincts telling him to pay attention. As he approached the counter, he caught a glimpse of the cashier's trembling fingers reaching into his pocket. Then, without looking up, the boy slid a small, crumpled piece of paper onto the counter. Shaq's eyes flicked to the note. The cashier hesitated before slowly unfolding it, his face turning pale as he read the words scribbled across it. A heavy silence settled over the store. And then, the front door chimed as someone else walked in. A tall, muscular man in a black jacket entered, his boots heavy against the tile floor. He didn't glance at the aisles, didn't even pretend to be browsing. Instead, he walked straight toward the counter, straight toward the teenager. Shaq didn't move, but his entire body tensed. The energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't just a nervous kid at work. Something was very, very wrong. The man's boots thudded against the floor as he approached the counter. Heavy, purposeful. The teen cashier stiffened. His hands gripped the edge of the counter so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Shaq could see his chest rising and falling. Quick, uneven breaths. The man stopped beside him. His presence was suffocating. Too close. Too controlling. "Everything all right here?" Shaq asked, keeping his tone casual but his eyes locked on the stranger. The man glanced at him. A quick, assessing look. Cold. Calculating. Then he forced a tight smile. "Yeah, we're good." His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, like a knife hidden beneath silk. Shaq wasn't buying it. He turned his attention to the teen. "You sure, man?" His voice was softer now, gentle, giving the kid an out. The boy swallowed hard. His gaze flickered to the note still in the cashier's hand. A silent plea. The cashier hesitated. Then, slowly, he slid the paper toward Shaq. Just a few inches, barely noticeable. But Shaq saw it. The man did too. His expression darkened. His jaw tightened. He reached out and clamped a hand onto the teen's shoulder. Not in a friendly way. In a way that said, "Stay quiet." Shaq's stomach nodded. His fingers curled slightly at his side. He exhaled slowly, steady, controlled. "Hey, kid," Shaq said, his voice even. "You dropped something." The teen hesitated. Then, as if finally deciding to take a chance, he nodded. Shaq reached out and picked up the note. He unfolded it with deliberate slowness, giving the man one last chance to step back. He didn't. The words on the crumpled paper made Shaq's blood turn ice cold. "Help me! He won't let me leave." Shaq's jaw clenched. His grip tightened around the note. He lifted his gaze, met the man's stare. The guy knew Shaq had read it, knew the situation had just changed, and in that moment, Shaq saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, not regret, something worse. Anger. Shaq set the note down, calm, measured, like he wasn't already planning his next move. Then he straightened to his full height, towering over the man, his presence alone shifting the energy in the room. "Let go of the kid," Shaq said. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable warning in it. The man didn't move. His fingers only tightened around the boy's shoulder. A silent standoff. Then slowly, deliberately, the man smirked. "Mind your business, big guy." Shaq didn't blink, didn't back down. His business? This was his business now. The man's smirk lingered, but his grip on the teen's shoulder tightened. Too tight. Shaq saw the boy flinch. Shaq stayed where he was, his massive frame an unmovable force between the man and the exit. His expression was calm, but inside a storm was brewing. "You all right, kid?" Shaq asked again, his voice low but firm. The teen's lips parted, but no words came out. His eyes darted toward the man, hesitation thick in his face. The man exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "I told you," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "He's fine. We're leaving." He yanked the boy's arm. The kid stumbled forward. Shaq moved before thinking. His hand, huge, steady, landed on the counter, right in front of them. A silent barrier. A message. "You're not going anywhere." The man froze. His smirk faded. Slowly, he turned to face Shaq. Their eyes locked. A challenge. "You got a problem?" the man asked, his voice lower now. "Dangerous." Shaq didn't blink. "Yeah," he said. "I do." The room felt smaller, tighter. The hum of the refrigerators, the buzz of the fluorescent lights, the faint rustling of candy wrappers on the shelves. It all faded into the background. All that mattered was this moment. The cashier swallowed hard, gripping the register like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The man squared his shoulders, puffing up slightly. But next to Shaq, he looked like a kid trying to act tough. "This ain't your business," the man said, his voice dipping into a growl. Shaq tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. "You made it my business when you put hands on him." The man scoffed. "He's my responsibility." Shaq's jaw flexed. "Then why's he asking for help?" Silence. Thick, uncomfortable. The man's fingers twitched at his side, like he was considering his next move. Shaq stayed still, his presence alone filling the space. "Let him go." For the first time, the man hesitated. His confidence cracked, just a little, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Shaq caught it. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Walk away, man. Right now. Before you regret it." The man's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists. For a second, Shaq thought he might actually listen. But then, the man reached into his jacket. Shaq's muscles tensed. The cashier gasped. The air turned electric. And in the next heartbeat, the gas station turned into something far more dangerous than a simple late-night stop. The moment his hand disappeared into his jacket, Shaq's instincts flared. He'd seen this before. Too many times. The cashier gasped, stepping back against the counter. The teen tensed, his breathing sharp and uneven. Shaq didn't move. Not yet. The man pulled something out. A folded piece of paper. Shaq exhaled slowly, his muscles still coiled. The man smirked. "Relax, big guy. Just my receipt." Shaq wasn't buying it. The teen flinched again as the man's grip tightened. His knuckles went white against the boy's hoodie. A silent scream in plain sight. Shaq had enough. "Let him go," Shaq said again. This time his voice edged with something deeper. A warning. The man scoffed. "I told you already." Shaq took a step forward. The smirk disappeared. The man shifted slightly, adjusting his stance. His grip on the teen stayed firm, but Shaq could see it now. The hesitation. "Good. You don't want to do this," Shaq said, his voice even, controlled. "Think real hard before you make your next move." The man clenched his jaw. His fingers twitched. Then, without warning, he shoved the teen toward the door. Shaq moved fast. His arm shot out, steadying the boy before he hit the ground. The kid gasped, stumbling but staying upright. The man bolted. Shaq wasn't letting that happen. He pivoted, blocking the door with one step. The man skidded to a stop, eyes darting around, desperate for an escape. "Move!" the man snapped. Shaq didn't. The man's chest rose and fell quickly, frustration twisting his features. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're making a mistake." Shaq let out a short breath. "You already made it." The man lunged. Not smart. Shaq barely had to try. He caught the guy mid-motion, planting a massive hand against his chest and stopping him cold. The man grunted, his feet skidding against the tile. Shaq held him there, firm but not hurting him. Not yet. "You really want to do this?" he asked, tilting his head. The man struggled, but Shaq didn't budge. Behind them, the cashier fumbled for something, probably his phone. The teen stood frozen, his hands shaking. "Call the cops," Shaq said without looking back. The cashier nodded, pressing the numbers with shaky fingers. The man's breathing turned erratic. His eyes flicked toward the door. Desperation. Shaq saw the shift before it happened. The man went for his pocket again. This time it wasn't paper. The gleam of a switchblade caught the fluorescent lights. Shaq's expression hardened. Big mistake. The moment the blade flashed, the tension in the room snapped. The cashier gasped. The teen flinched, pressing himself against the counter. Shaq, however, didn't even blink. He had dealt with fear before. He had faced threats. But this wasn't fear. This was control. The man gripped the knife tightly, his knuckles turning white. His breathing was fast, erratic, desperate. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had seconds to act. "Put it down," Shaq said, his voice steady, deep, commanding. The man hesitated. Good. But hesitation wasn't enough. Shaq moved. Before the man could react, Shaq's massive hand clamped around his wrist. The pressure was immediate. The blade clattered to the ground, skidding across the tile. The man yelped, struggling against Shaq's grip. But it was useless. Shaq was an unmovable force. The teen took a sharp breath, his eyes darting to the fallen knife. His hands trembled. This was his moment. The cashier, still frozen, suddenly realized the note was still in his grasp. Shaq saw it. "Give me that," Shaq said, his free hand reaching. The cashier hesitated, then slowly slid the crumpled paper toward him. Shaq took it, his fingers unfolding the creases. 2 words stood out immediately, scrawled in desperate, shaky handwriting. "Help me." Shaq's chest tightened. His grip on the man's wrist didn't loosen, but his eyes flicked up, straight into the teen's. The boy swallowed hard. His lips parted, but no words came out. Shaq lowered his voice. "Did he write this?" The cashier gave a barely perceptible nod. Shaq looked at the teen again. "This about you?" The boy didn't move at first. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Shaq's jaw clenched. The man twisted under Shaq's grip. "That's nothing," he spat. "Kid's just acting out." Shaq didn't even acknowledge him. His mind was racing. This wasn't just some bad interaction. This was worse. He looked at the note again, flipping it over. There was more. "He won't let me leave." Shaq's breath came slow and controlled, but his muscles tensed. His gaze locked onto the man. "You got something you want to tell me?" Shaq asked, his voice dangerously low. The man sneered. "Yeah, let me go." Shaq's grip tightened. The man winced. Behind them, the distant sound of sirens began to wail. Shaq glanced back at the teen. "You're safe now," he promised. The boy's eyes welled with tears. But it wasn't over yet, because now Shaq knew. This wasn't just a bad situation. This was a rescue. The sirens were getting louder. The man heard them too. His entire body tensed, his eyes darting toward the door. Escape. That's what he was thinking. Not today. Shaq shifted, planting himself firmly between the man and the exit. His massive frame filled the doorway, making it clear. No one was getting past him. The man's breathing turned ragged. His mind raced, calculating his next move. Shaq saw it in his eyes, panic, desperation. "You don't want to do this," Shaq warned, his voice low and even. The man scoffed, masking his fear with arrogance. "You think you can stop me?" Shaq tilted his head slightly. "I don't think," he said. "I know." The man took a step forward, his muscles coiling like a spring. But the second he moved, Shaq moved faster. With a single step, Shaq closed the gap. His sheer presence swallowed the space between them, suffocating any illusion of control the man still had. The man faltered. His confidence wavered. Shaq leaned in, his voice a deep rumble. "You're done." Behind them, the teen pressed himself against the counter, his breathing shaky. The cashier had his phone out, still recording. The sirens were right outside now. Red and blue lights flashed through the glass windows. The man turned his head slightly, eyes flickering toward the commotion outside. His last chance. With a sudden, reckless burst of energy, he lunged, shoving Shaq with everything he had. It was like running into a brick wall. Shaq didn't budge. Not an inch. Instead, he reached forward, wrapping one massive hand around the man's shoulder and yanking him back with ease. The man let out a strangled grunt, twisting and flailing, but it was useless. Shaq had him locked down. "Let me go," he snarled, his voice dripping with frustration. Shaq shook his head. "Not happening." The doors burst open. Two police officers stormed in, hands on their weapons. Shaq didn't even flinch. He simply turned, keeping his grip tight. "Right on time," Shaq said, nodding toward the officers. The man thrashed harder, but Shaq held firm. One of the officers stepped forward. "Sir, let him go. We've got him from here." Shaq hesitated for half a second, then released his grip. The moment he did, the officers pounced. The man barely had time to react before he was forced to the ground, his arms wrenched behind his back. Cuffs snapped into place. It was over. Shaq let out a slow breath, glancing over at the teen. The boy was still frozen in place, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's okay now," Shaq said, his voice softer. The teen swallowed hard. Then, for the first time all night, he nodded. The store was dead silent. The only sounds were the flickering buzz of the fluorescent lights and the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Outside, the sirens blared louder. Red and blue lights flashed against the gas station windows, casting eerie shadows across the walls. But inside, no one moved. The police were here. The man knew it. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal, searching for an escape. Shaq could see it, the gears turning in his head, the last traces of arrogance melting into desperation. Then, in a single frantic move, the man lunged, not toward Shaq, toward the teen. It happened fast, too fast. The man grabbed the boy's wrist, yanking him forward. The teen gasped, struggling, fear flashing in his wide eyes. "Let's go," the man hissed, his voice sharp, urgent. "Now!" Shaq didn't think. He reacted. With one massive step, he reached out and clamped his hand around the man's forearm, stopping him cold. The man turned wild-eyed. "Get off me!" Shaq's grip tightened. He didn't squeeze, didn't have to. His sheer strength alone sent a clear message. "You're not leaving," Shaq said, his voice steady, firm. The teen whimpered, his breath shaky. "Hey!" one of the officers shouted from the doorway. "Step away from the kid." The man froze. His fingers twitched. Then his free hand shot toward his pocket. Shaq knew what was coming. The blade. It glinted under the store's fluorescent lights as the man flicked it open in one swift motion. A switchblade. Small, but deadly in the wrong hands. The cashier gasped, stepping back. The teen went rigid, his body shaking. Shaq, though, didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just stared, his deep brown eyes locked onto the man's trembling grip on the knife. "You don't want to do this," Shaq said, his voice calm, controlled. The officers had their hands on their holsters now. One more wrong move, and this would end badly, for him. But Shaq wasn't about to let it go that far. The man's breath was ragged, his fingers flexing around the handle of the knife. This was his last play, his final shot at control. Shaq took a slow step forward. The man twitched, raising the blade slightly. "I'll do it," he muttered. Shaq tilted his head unfazed. "No," he said. "You won't." And then Shaq moved, fast. His massive hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist like a vice. With a single practiced motion, he twisted. The knife clattered to the floor. The officers lunged. The man didn't even have time to react before he was tackled to the ground, his arms yanked behind his back. Cuffs snapped. The fight was over. Shaq exhaled. The teen? He burst into quiet, shaky sobs. The man thrashed on the floor, his face twisted in rage. "Get off me!" he spat, struggling against the officers pinning him down. But it was over. The knife lay forgotten on the cold tile, its dull metallic sheen catching the gas station lights. Shaq turned away from the scene, his focus shifting to the trembling teen beside him. The boy's breaths came in quick, uneven gasps. His hands, still clutching the crumpled note, shook violently. "Hey," Shaq said gently, crouching down to his level. "You're okay now." The teen didn't respond. His body was still locked in fear. Shaq knew that feeling, that shock, the mind struggling to process that the nightmare is finally ending. The officers dragged the man to his feet, his hands cuffed behind his back. "You don't know what you've done," the man sneered, glaring at Shaq. "You just ruined everything." Shaq didn't even look at him, didn't acknowledge the words. Instead, he placed a massive, reassuring hand on the teen's shoulder. "Deep breaths, kid," he said. "You're safe." The words finally broke through. The teen inhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling as he tried to calm himself. One of the officers, Ramirez, approached. "Sir, we need to take his statement." Shaq nodded, then looked at the teen. "You good to talk?" The boy hesitated. Then for the first time he met Shaq's eyes. Tears welled in them, but behind the fear was something else. Relief. The teen gave a small nod. Shaq stayed close as the officer led him to the counter. The cashier, who had been frozen in shock, finally exhaled. "Man, I thought that guy was gonna—" He stopped, shaking his head. "You really saved him." Shaq didn't feel like a hero. He just did what had to be done. He turned back toward the officers. The man was being let out, still muttering threats under his breath. Shaq's jaw clenched. He had seen men like that before. Controlling, dangerous, willing to do whatever it took to keep power. But not this time. Not today. Shaq walked toward the exit. He wasn't leaving yet, but he needed air. Needed to process what just happened. As he reached the door, he heard it, a soft voice behind him. "Thank you." Shaq turned. The teen stood there, his face still pale but his eyes steady, stronger. Shaq nodded. "Anytime, kid." The night air hit him as he stepped outside, the flashing red and blue lights still painting the parking lot. He looked up at the sky, exhaling. This wasn't how he expected his night to go. But maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across the gas station walls. Shaq stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching as the officers loaded the man into the squad car. The teen sat on the curb, knees pulled to his chest. His fingers picked at the hem of his hoodie, a nervous habit. Officer Ramirez crouched beside him. "All right, son, we need to know what's going on. Who is that man?" The boy hesitated. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Shaq took a step closer. "Kid, you don't have to be afraid. He can't hurt you anymore." The boy inhaled shakily. Then finally he spoke. "He's not my dad." His voice was barely above a whisper. He took me." Ramirez's posture stiffened. "Took you? From where?" The teen's lip trembled. "From my home. Months ago." A heavy silence fell over the parking lot. Shaq felt his stomach drop. He had suspected something was off. But this was worse than he thought. "I tried to escape before," the boy continued, voice cracking. "But he always found me. Said no one would believe me. Said I belonged to him now." His eyes darted toward the police car, where the man sat, glaring through the window. Shaq clenched his jaw. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Ramirez gave the teen a reassuring nod. "You're safe now, all right? We're going to make sure of it." The officer turned toward his partner. "Vega, check missing persons reports. See if his name comes up." Vega nodded, already tapping into the database. Shaq crouched down in front of the teen. "What's your name, kid?" For a moment, the boy hesitated. Then finally he whispered, "Jason." Shaq smiled. "That's a strong name." Jason managed the tiniest of nods. A moment later, Vega's radio crackled. "Got something," she said. "Missing persons alert from 3 months ago. Jason Carter, 14, reported missing by his mother." Shaq's heart clenched. Ramirez turned back to Jason. "That's you, isn't it?" Tears welled in Jason's eyes, but he nodded. Ramirez clicked his radio. "Dispatch, we need immediate contact with the Carter family. Let them know we found their son." Jason sniffled, rubbing his sleeve over his face. "She's still looking for me?" Shaq's throat tightened. He placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "She never stopped," he said. Jason let out a shaky breath. his whole body trembling as the reality sank in. He was going home. The officers moved quickly, radioing in updates, securing the scene. The man in the squad car was no longer spewing threats, just sitting in bitter silence, his fate sealed. Shaq stood up, exhaling deeply. Tonight, a kid's life had changed, and so had his own. Jason sat in the back of the police car, staring out the window. His hands rested in his lap, still trembling. For months, he had dreamed of this moment, of being free. But now that it was real, it didn't feel like he thought it would. He felt lost. Shaq stood outside, speaking with Officer Ramirez. His deep voice was calm, steady. Jason couldn't hear the words, but the way Shaq spoke made him feel safe. Safer than he'd felt in a long time. A car pulled up, headlights cutting through the darkness. A woman rushed out before it even stopped completely. Jason's breath hitched. "Mom?" She sprinted toward him, tears streaking her face. "Jason!" The car door swung open, but Jason hesitated. What if things weren't the same? What if she was mad? Before he could think any further, his mother threw her arms around him, pulling him into the tightest hug he had ever felt. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "You're home," she whispered. "You're finally home." Jason's arms wrapped around her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself believe it. Shaq stepped back, watching the reunion. His heart felt full. This was why he had stepped in. Ramirez gave Shaq a nod. "You did good tonight." Shaq shrugged. The kid did all the hard work. He was brave. Jason pulled away from his mother and turned to Shaq. His eyes were still red, but there was something new in them. Hope. "Thank you," Jason said, his voice strong despite the emotions behind it. Shaq smiled. "You don't gotta thank me, kid. You did what you had to do. That took guts." Jason hesitated, then reached into his hoodie pocket. He pulled out the crumpled toy car he had kept with him since he was taken. It was scratched, beaten up, but it was his. "This was the only thing I had with me the whole time," Jason said. "It reminded me of home." Shaq crouched down to eye level. "And now you're going back there, where you belong." Jason nodded. His mother wiped her tears, smoothing his hair. "Let's go home." Jason climbed into the passenger seat, glancing back at Shaq one last time. A silent thank you. Shaq gave him a small salute as the car drove away. He exhaled, shaking his head. He hadn't planned on stopping at that gas station. He hadn't planned on saving a kid's life. But sometimes you're exactly where you need to be. As Shaq walked back to his SUV, he glanced up at the night sky. Somewhere out there, Jason was safe, sleeping in his own bed, free. And that was all that mattered.